joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I think everyone wants to know who is Nisha Pahuja. What brought her to make the world before her? I think the movie is sort of playing in our heads in many ways as conversations. Why didn't you take us through your journey first as a professional, as a director?
Sure. So I am originally from India. I was born in Delhi, and I moved to Toronto to Canada when I was obviously very young. Was raised there, and I grew up in a family that was fairly conservative, very traditional, which was very difficult for me, especially growing up in North America, where none of my friends had the same restrictions. So I began to kind of question these notions of gender and equality when I was quite young. Left home, eventually got into social services, but that didn't seem to kind of answer a desire for the arts, I guess, for me, and fell into documentary filmmaking as a researcher. And once I got into it, I felt like I'd finally found the thing that I really wanted to do, because it combined creative expression with social justice, and both of those things are really important to me. And The World Before Her was a film that I started in 2008, and initially it was a very simple concept, and it was really just looking at the Miss India contest, and I was going to follow a few women going through the pageant process, and using the pageant as a way to look at a country that was going through a lot of cultural changes, and exploring the role of women in this new kind of emerging India. And then the film started to become more and more layered and more complex the deeper I got into the research. And then shortly after, I met Prachi Trivedi, who's the leader of the Durga Vaini camp that we meet in the film. And she told me about these Durga camps, and then I became quite determined to get access to that world as well. So,
Wow, what a journey! I think it's amazing. As somebody who works with the men, and as somebody who runs a business that impacts women at the end of it, they're two very distinct trends I find. Either your angst converts into something very powerful. You take that and build it either into a career or a movement, or you write a book, or you sort of make sure your expression is channelized, or you become more militant about the beliefs that have been driven into you. And I was sitting in the hall, I couldn't help noticing the two very distinct trends, and I see that very commonly. And uh, how do you think about that? What's your observation when you meet younger women who are still very early on in their lives? I mean, experience hasn't been sort of hardened them.
I think, I find the thing that I find really amazing, actually, and it's also what I found pretty amazing in the film, was that the young women, they seem to all want the same thing. I think as India evolves and changes, and we're becoming so open to the media and the internet, and increasingly we become sort of a globalized world, and a global world where all these distinctions are starting to sort of melt in some part. More and more women are kind of aspiring to have freedom, to have equality. They want rights. They're questioning those old notions of patriarchy and the things that held them back, and they're resisting. In their own way, they resist as much as they can those sorts of shackles. So I'm finding that more and more. And then again, because of that, also there's now a backlash against them, because we're talking about power. Fundamentally, I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a rebalancing of power, a shift in power, and nobody wants to give up their power. Nobody, whether it's a prime minister, sort of handing over the mantle, or a patriarch, giving up his authority over a woman.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a tricky question. So, given the fact nobody wants to give up power, and I think the women's movement worldwide has struggled to take back the power, or at least bring equality into the conversation, equality into the rights, equality into the workplace. Uh, I mean, given that India just elected a extreme right government and everything that's going on, uh, in context of the women's rights movement at large. I think being liberal or being a feminist is becoming more and more of a minority today. And
Yep.
I also find that the younger people, the younger women, have a pressure to stay off the women's movement in a very direct sort of way. What do you make of this
See
trend?
that again? I didn't quite hear you.
I said, there's a lot of pressure on young women to stay off movements, the women's rights movements, or write about it. Being a liberal is a hard place in India today because it perhaps doesn't gel with the whole rise of Hindutva or the whole rise of
Right.
uh, independent women are homebreakers, independent women sort of care more about their career than their family, they're tradition breakers. So I find the young girls have a lot of pressure on them to stay away from the labels of being a feminist or liberal or a secular. I mean, how do you observe that?
Well, it was definitely interesting in terms of filming with the Miss Indias. There was definitely kind of a disdain on their part for the feminists. You know, they didn't quite understand them. They felt that they were sort of a throwback, and of course, they didn't quite. They had a real issue with the fact that feminists had a problem with beauty contests. Um, but I find actually the young women that I engage with, that I speak to, and certainly the women that have been writing in who've seen the film, they really relate. They really relate to the larger issues of what it means, the conflict that still exists in this society, no matter where you are on the spectrum as a woman. You're still defined by your gender. You're still a woman first, and I think they understand that. They really do. They really do relate to that. I think for me, and it's hard to say whether this is going to be the reality or not, because the government has just come into power, so it's very difficult to say. But there is, for me, this fear that what Hindutva and what this, kind of belief system, what it does in terms of women, is it really does relegate them to the household, to the four walls of the house, right? Or it gives them work, but it still has that kind of very paternalistic, patriarchal attitude of women are to be protected. There's still kind of your property, right? So I'm afraid that that attitude will come back in a really major way in terms of kind of the government systems, the very structure of the country, right? If you've got a government that believes in this kind of prejudice, that they'll impose it. It already exists within the system, but now it'll become possibly more deeply entrenched.
Sure. Sure. And let's hope for the best as we go forward. I couldn't help thinking of all the perseverance, of all the hard work, and all the persuasion that went into making the world before her. The courage to get into those camps and convince them to get on camera. In fact, some of the shots I've seen in the trailers, and you know, it's just so tough. How did you crack that?
So it seems. I guess when you're in it, it doesn't seem that tough, right? I mean, you're a journalist, right? And when you're a journalist and you want to do something, you become very, very determined to make it happen. And actually, as documentary filmmakers, your job really is to go into worlds that other people would not have access to. Your job is to kind of shed light, sort of in darker corners. That's our role. So we take that very seriously. It's not just me; it's just documentary filmmakers in general. We're sort of intrepid that way. So for me, it was almost kind of a systematic very systematic approach in some sense that I knew the kind of film that I wanted to make. I know the kind of person that I am for the most part, which is a fairly non-judgmental person. I try to understand people as opposed to judging them right away. You know, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I knew this was a very sensitive subject. You know, both worlds were very sensitive, and I just built relationships. You know, especially in the Durga camp, within the Hindutva fold, just really built up a relationship of trust with a lot of people within the movement, um, and and that's how really I got access. You know, and for me, I feel two things. I feel that they recognized for them that there was a value in actually, you know, letting me film because it would go out to the public. And whether we believe in their message or not, right? They want their message to go out, and so they saw me as a vehicle in some sense. You know, that's definitely one part of it. The other part was I really believe that fundamentally all of us want to be understood. You know, all of us want somebody to hear us. You know, all of us want in a non-judgmental kind of way, right? So that was the other. I think that was the other reason they trusted me and they opened up to me.
Suspending judgment.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, I have a very professional question, which is making a product. Making a product is one thing, and marketing is another. And as I talk to a lot of women, I think women are brilliant at what they do, but they're not so great at, you know, blowing their own trumpet, putting their product out there, or that's something a lot of them have hesitation about. And I know that you've been putting in a lot of effort to make sure the movie reaches the right corners. I know you've been working really hard, and tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, you know, for me, it became really important to use the film as part of a larger discussion on women's rights in India. You know, and I had again, I sort of thought, okay, how am I going to make sure that this film has an impact? You know, how do we do that? How do we ensure that it becomes part of the dialogue and that people really start talking and they really start engaging? And it became really important, you know, just before the elections because, you know, I wanted people to see what was happening in these Durga camps. So I became really determined, and I thought, how am I going to do this? You know, and so of course you were part of the Kickstarter campaign. Thank you so much for constantly helping us publicize that. That was amazing.
Yes.
So you know, I became really determined to get it out there, and so the Kickstarter was one incredible way because I found people who really supported what I was doing, and they started to spread, and they also became part of the movement of the film. You know. And then, of course, partnering up with somebody like Anurag Kashyap, right? I mean, he's a brand in India, and people love him, and he's very well respected and regarded. I had really great celebrity supporters. That really helped me, you know. So Anurag, Lisa Ray, Deepa Mehta, Nandita Das, now Kuntana has been tweeting about us, Amitabh Bachchan, you know. So all of these people, somehow they start hearing about it, and they start to get the word out, and that moves it towards the mainstream, and it moves it towards the masses, you know, which is what you want. And then for me, that's one part of what I'm trying to do, because I think you have to mobilize the middle classes because they're the ones with real power, you know. Then the other aspect is this: it's very targeted for me, and that's to take the film across the country, you know, to colleges and universities, to young people, and then also to sort of rural areas, you know, have the film dubbed and really work with NGOs and women's rights activists in rural areas where we can really have an impact on female infanticide, you know, and also feticide in cities. So so you just have to, I think what you have to do is you have to have a goal, you have to have a vision, you have to know what it is that you're trying to do, you know, and why. Your motives, I think, have to be very clear because it's your motives that are going to sell your idea, you know. So I was very clear in terms of that, and then I had a very systematic. I've put together a very systematic plan in terms of how do I achieve my goal. Yeah.
You know, it's amazing that you used Kickstarter. I always one of the things that I strongly believe is that the digital economy is great for women. It allows them to do everything they want to do better, faster, build better networks, reach out to more customers, reach out to more people. And as I've seen you take this movie across, I think it's a wonderful example of how digital is great for women. And I really hope that this example goes out, your movie goes out to many more women. I have a question on bringing men in the conversation. You spoke about Anurag Kashyap, and I find the major difference in the newer conversations being generated about women's rights, the newer conversations about women at work, about changing the game, is that a lot of men are now partners. I think what used to be us and we conversation is now a very blended conversation between ideologies and thought process.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, and that's actually, I think that's the only, it's really the most important thing that we can do is to involve men in the conversation, is to actually, because I mean, it's human rights, we keep thinking of it as women's rights, and it's not women's rights, it's human rights, and you have to involve everybody in that dialogue, You have to get them to see almost. For me, it's a moral argument, and you have to get them to see that it's morally wrong to oppress somebody based on gender. It's morally wrong to think that you are better than anybody else. So yeah.
I know. True. I think that's very true. We have a little comment which I'm going to just read out for you, which is from Tanvi Desai, who says one of the most choking moments for me was when these young girls were taught how to use the rifles.
Yeah.
Was it tough just to see where this might head?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just plugging in because I'm running out of battery power here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It was. There were lots of things in the camp that really surprised me. I think, and that of course was one of them. Like having training young girls how to use arms. That was definitely very, very problematic. I think when it's become now, what I filmed actually is more. It's harder now to look at that stuff because of the new government that's in power, right? Now is when I feel like, okay, this is, what does this mean? What is, how potentially dangerous, is this, right? So it's the fear is, it's only now starting to really becoming of greater concern now.
True.
Definitely.
I think I'm going to sort of also walk us through. You talk about moving the needle on women's rights in India, and give us an assessment of your situation. One, your exposure to the West, and West is also seeing what is termed as the rise of corporate feminism. I mean, there are a lot more powerful women pulling in their weight for women's rights, but there are of course many diverse views on this. And India, given its very different context and very different socio-economic uh, uh, composition, I think, so where do you see this going? Where do you see the women's rights movement heading to in India?
In India. It's an amazing movement, isn't it? I mean, it's massive. It involves everybody, women at sort of the rural level, at the village level. Obviously, women in cities, young women. It's all encompassing. It's a really powerful movement, and I think that's really what gives me so much optimism in terms of women's rights in India. Because that movement is so irrepressible. I've over the course of the years, I've met a number of Indian feminists, and the things that they have gone through, being harassed, being beaten, being arrested, death threats. I mean, the things that they have endured, in the name of equality. It's amazing. So it gives me a lot of hope, actually. I feel that it will just really kind of move forward, and I'm hoping that young women actually become more and more involved and more engaged, in the movement. Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to bring this uh, in connection to what we do, which is about women and having careers. So the career conversation is it's very central to the rise of women in the West, but
Yeah.
that's also meant that the rise has been only in pockets, or it's especially the rise to the top has been very limited. I mean, the West is still struggling with issues like women in boards and women in CXO positions. Uh, I have a sense that in India we have an opportunity to do it very differently, because maybe we don't need to use the exact models and maybe build them indigenously, empower women in whatever kind of work format. So one of the things at Sheroes we strongly believe is that technology can be that bridge which the West didn't have when this movement was on. Bringing work at home, bringing more entrepreneurial opportunities, bringing more creative opportunities out. Do you see that as a
Yeah.
possibility when you look at the West and India?
Yeah, that's actually, a brilliant kind of it's a brilliant kind of realization, actually, that in some sense, we have these tools now that weren't necessarily available earlier, and we can actually use these tools, for the betterment. I mean, you see how technology has kind of impacted all sorts of human rights movements around the world. And it's an extraordinary, it's a really extraordinary thing. We're actually thinking of using, we're still figuring out how we're going to do it, but we're thinking of sort of using the internet when we go on our tour, to somehow connect women in these sorts of rural areas, with women in kind of urban areas, to sort of talk about these issues. So yeah, it's definitely, can be definitely, a way to empower people, for sure.
Brilliant. So one last question, Leila. I'm going to ask you about what next for the World Before Her. How can we help? What do you have to say to all the Sheroes out there, all the women out there? Tell
Uh,
us more.
I mean, for the film is just going to continue, right? It'll sort of it'll do its theatrical run, and then we'll do the grassroots sort of screening tour starting in October, which will be, really incredible. For people who have seen the film, we're going to be starting a space. We'll have an online space where people can start to kind of post their blogs and their comments and ask questions and even talk amongst each other. Because one of the things that we're finding with the film is a lot of people are expressing their emotions and what the film evokes for them, which has been really, really wonderful. But I think my message is one of just I think of compassion, I hope, right? I think what happened is for me as a woman, I realized that what patriarchy does is it puts all of us into a box, not just women, but also men. It gives each of us a role to play, right? So when I started to see it that way, I had a lot more compassion for the men around me, especially people like my father, who I've always thought of as being, sort of a domineering kind of patriarchal figure. And I realize actually he's like me, not free either. So.
True. I think that's true. I have one viewer question, if you would allow me to take
Sure.
that, and we can close after that.
Okay.
Uh, Whereas Anu asks, how did the girls at Durga Vahini camp cope with being told to be fierce and use rifles while being docile and getting married early at the same
Yeah.
time? Aren't these opposite ideas?
Yeah. That was uh, that's such a great question, and it was something that really stunned me when we were filming. And I actually confronted a lot of people while we were filming about this. Some of the women who were teaching them how to be how to serve a plate. There was one sequence that we didn't use in the film where girls were taught also just even how to serve a meal properly. And I said to them, doesn't this sort of run counter to teaching them how to use arms? Aren't you giving these girls mixed messages? On the one hand, you're teaching them subservience, and then on the other hand, you're teaching them to be empowered, right? And they didn't understand the contradiction. They didn't understand the question. And I think for me, what that said was that in their worldview, all of these things can coexist. So, with somebody like Prachi, there's definitely kind of a psychic. There's definitely an issue, right? She's really, that she's really struggling with these issues and these ideas, and the contradictions. But for the most part, the women in the camp, they didn't question it. Actually, they did not question, as far as I could gauge.
Great. I think that's actually a wonderful message, to drop judgment, create more acceptance, and stay clear with it. One very quick last question on the censor board from Pooja, who says, did you face any challenge in showcasing that you truly wanted to?
Yes, there were definitely some issues, but interestingly, I mean, the film was passed without any cuts. So there were no cuts. I mean, there were two very minor things that I had to change. They were just really kind of mostly almost aesthetic. But yeah, no, there were, we were very, very worried, and yet very, very pleased at the fact that we were allowed, that the film, is running, and there were no cuts, So amazing.
Wonderful. I think that's more to openness and awareness, more to creative liberties. So I think we've come to the end of this session, Nisha. Thank you so much for joining us. We love what you're doing, and we continue to support you. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you for being so supportive. Thank you so much. See you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Nisha.
Bye.